In our last video, I showed you a couple ways to get WordPress installed from the command line. Before we start writing our project code, I want to do a little more setup to get organized and feel in control of the code that we'll be using. You can see here how the default WordPress install is set up, with everything mixed together in one big folder. This is what happened after we installed WordPress, and it would be the same if you installed it from command line or downloaded the files or however you did it. Now, we've got our configuration file here in the web root. We also have plugins and themes inside this core setup. This is also where we would put our own custom plugins and our own custom themes. We'd mix those all together with everything else. And since I use version control for all of my projects, I have to commit all of the WordPress code here into my own repository, and I don't really want to do that. The WordPress team has done something pretty awesome just for me. This is the entire WordPress Subversion repository, auto-synced every 15 minutes. I can show you the branches list here. It goes back to 1.5. We've got all the tags here, every minor version with every commit SHA. This is great. Now, you wouldn't use this like a regular GitHub repository. You're not going to submit pull requests. You may fork it, but I'm not really interested in that right now. What I'm mostly interested in is that this allows you to use submodules. Git submodules are nested repositories. They're really helpful if you want to rely on other code that's managed in some other Git repo, and you want to kind of import that into your own project without having to copy all of the code in and start managing it inside of your own repository. So this way, you can actually have a repo that's basically just a pointer to another repo, and then you can manage them both separately, but still have them involved in the same project. It's a little confusing, but I'll show you how it works in a minute. I will say some people don't like Git submodules because they're confusing. I will leave that up to you whether or not you want to do that. Whatever we do with a submodule, you could also do just by downloading WordPress into its own directory and managing it from there. But let me show you how, if you did want to use a submodule, how you could do that. And the way we do that is git submodule add, and then the WordPress repo URL. And then the last parameter is optional. It's just where you want to put it. We're going to put it in the public folder, in another folder that I'm calling site. Okay, so now that it's downloaded, let me show you what we've got. In our public folder now, all the files are removed, but we do have this folder. Let me get rid of this file. We don't have it anymore. We have our new site folder, and inside there, our familiar WordPress directory. But now, this is not a part of our repository, and we actually never have to touch this code. This is nice, but you may notice two pretty big problems. One, our config file would normally be right here in the folder that we're not supposed to touch. And same with our plugins and themes, our whole entire content folder, including the uploads, are now in a folder that we're also not supposed to touch. So how do we take care of this? Let's go ahead and fix the configuration first. WordPress is going to, by default, look for a wp-config.php file right here in the root. But if it doesn't find it there, it will actually automatically look one folder up. And that's in a folder that we control. So if I go ahead and put a wp-config file right here, it's now in the public folder, this will work fine, except that I don't really want my configuration files in the web root at all. So I'm going to put them actually out here in my project folder. I'm going to create a new folder called config, and then inside there, I'll create a new file called wordpress.php. And that's where ultimately I will have all of my configuration. So for my wp-config file, which is the one that WordPress is looking for, I'm just going to include it. And then our wordpress.php file will actually be where all the configuration is. I'm going to paste in what we had before. So now all of our database settings are here, and we're set. Our other big problem is that the WP content folder is still inside this submodule. And that's where we need to edit plugin files, install custom third-party plugins, create our own code, our uploads for everything on the site, all the images that get uploaded, they would all be in here. And that's not our repository, so we can't really do that without causing some big problems for ourselves. So we need to somehow get this content folder out. And luckily, WordPress allows you to do that with some pretty flexible constants. First, we'll define something I like to call app root. And that's just going to be the directory of our project, so that everything else that we build can use that, and if we do need to move things around, we'll only have to change the value of this one constant. Next, we'll define some WordPress variables, WP Home and WP Site URL. What these do is they actually override the options table in the database and allow us to set our URLs for the site, both the actual URL of the site as well as the URL to where the WordPress files live. And this way we don't have to worry about the database. If we change this from different environments, which I'll show you later, we can actually have that defined in code instead of having to modify the database, which is really nice. Next, we'll actually handle that WP content problem. We're going to define two more constants. The first is WP content dir, and this will use our app root, and then we'll point it to public/content. So we're going to create another folder in the public folder, which I'll do right now. We'll call it content. And inside there is where we can have our plugins, our themes, and our uploads. And now we can manage them outside of the WordPress repository. So WordPress requires us to define the content directory as well as the content URL, which is the URL that it also needs to find. So I'm using constants here so that, again, everything kind of maps together. So it's the home URL, which is, for me, project.me/content, which is exactly where we'll find all those files. The last one that we're going to do is the debug setting, which is WP_debug. We're going to set that to true. So this is great, but you might see one last problem that we need to address before we wrap up. And that's the fact that I've just turned WP debug on, and I've set a URL. And this might actually be a URL more like dev.project.me, so that I can look at my development site. That's a problem because now my configuration, when I push this to the production server, is going to have to be changed. And changing this one file every time we push is going to be a bit of a pain. So I'd like to be able to actually have different configuration files for each environment that I'm developing in. And it's actually pretty easy to do. The first thing we'll do is we'll actually look for the existence of a local file. So I'm saying if the file exists in the app root in a folder called env inside of our config folder, so let's make that folder right now. If there's a file in there called local.php, we're going to require that in. Now I don't need this, but this might be good for someone if there's someone on your team who has some very unique setup on their own local machine and they can't use the development server for whatever reason. They can have a local file, and we actually add this to the gitignore. So in the gitignore, you would say config env local.php, and that way it would not add this file to the repository. So when you push this to other environments, this file will never show up. If there is no local file, we're going to look for a file in the app root in that same env folder, but it's going to be named the same as the environment that we're in. So we need to define this app env. So up here we'll say define app env. What should it be? We're going to use the PHP function getEnv, which is for an environment variable. And we're going to look for one called application_env. So on each server you could set this up. Staging, testing, production, whatever you want to call each of your server environments. You can also do this in the httpd.conf files. You can do this in a number of ways. You could check the URL, which is a little bit more fragile. You can do it however you want. You just have to have a way to be able to determine which environment you're in. Once you've gotten that set up, now I'm looking for a file called development.php inside of this folder. Now we have one. And in WordPress, we're going to actually remove everything that we don't need here. So that's going to be all of our constants that we just defined, all of our database settings, which could change per environment. We probably want different salts on each environment, and that's probably about it. Everything else we want to keep the same across all environments. So I'm going to remove those, and now our WordPress.php file is a little smaller. And in development, we'll add that back. I could have a staging.php, production.php, and I can change these values for every environment. Now, just to verify that this all works, let's go back to the WordPress dashboard. We'll reload. This is okay. It's looking for WP admin in the root. And if you remember, we moved it into a folder called site. So if we add site back to our URL, so we can see everything's still working. If I switch over to front page, you'll see an error, and that's actually on purpose. Let me show you this very small theme I've created with the bare minimum files. And in the index file, I have just a little message saying we're on the default theme, and then a PHP error with no semicolon, which should generate a parse error. And because we have debug turned on, we're seeing this descriptive error message telling us what's going on. Just to verify that this environment switching actually works, let's go ahead and make a local.php file. We'll copy over everything in development, exactly as is. We'll just change WP debug to false. And now if I go back to the browser and reload the page, we get this familiar server error message because debug is not turned on, so we're not getting the error reporting that we would otherwise get. So you can see this is actually working, and we could also have our shared development, our testing, our staging, our production, all of our environments all tuned exactly how we want, and all of that stored in version control, which is exactly what I wanted. So now that my configuration has moved out of the web root, I have a custom directory for my plugins and my other WordPress code, and I have my Git repository set up exactly the way I want. I'm now ready to finally start building our project, which we'll start in the next video.